4,500 years of silence, not because the pyramids kept any secrets, but because the people who should have told the truth never did. What you were taught about the builders of ancient Egypt was shaped by a Greek traveller who arrived 2,000 years too late. Colonial explorers who refused to believe what they were looking at, and a pop culture machine that found mystery far more profitable than evidence. This is the story of how the greatest construction achievement in human history was buried, not in sand, but in centuries of deliberate distortion. Picture this. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Human civilization, barely 6,000 years documented. Now narrow it down even further. The pyramids of Egypt, built roughly 4,500 years ago, and yet, for most of recorded history, yet nobody truly understood them. Here is the astonishing part. The pyramids were never hidden. They were never buried, never locked away, never erased. They stood in plain sight, the largest stone structures ever assembled, and still the world got the story completely wrong for centuries. So the real question is not, what if the pyramids were covered up? The records show something stranger than any cover-up. They were misunderstood. Standing on the Giza Plateau, just outside modern Cairo, you are looking at a structure that contains an estimated 2,300,000 individual stone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons. The Great Pyramid of Giza, raised under the reign of Pharaoh Khufu during Egypt's Old Kingdom period, it is so precisely aligned with true north that modern engineers, using satellite technology, cannot improve on it. So perfectly level is its base that the four corners vary by less than 2 centimetres across a footprint covering roughly 5.5 hectares. That is not mythology, that is engineering. And yet the dominant story told about the pyramids for most of the last 2,000 years had almost nothing to do with engineering. It had to do with slaves, with aliens, with lost civilizations and impossible technologies, and the idea that ordinary human beings could not possibly have done this. Where did that story come from? This is where things get interesting, because the distortion did not begin with Hollywood. It did not begin with conspiracy theorists. It began far earlier and far closer to the source than most people realize. Enter Herodotus. The ancient Greek historian, often called the father of history, visited Egypt around 440 years BC. He wrote vivid accounts of the pyramid builders, accounts of forced labour, suffering, and 100,000 workers toiling under the lash of their pharaoh. His words became one of the most influential passages in all of ancient literature. There is one problem. Herodotus wrote those words roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. He was not recording history. He was collecting gossip, oral traditions, second-hand stories, interpretations filtered through 2 millennia of cultural distance. And because he was among the first to write extensively about Egypt in a language that later scholars could read, his version of events became the foundation on which century after century of misunderstanding was stacked. Now think about what that means. Imagine that every account of the Apollo moon landings was lost, and the only surviving record came from a travel writer who visited Cape Canaveral 2,000 years from now, interviewing locals about what they had heard their great-great-grandparents say. Would that account be reliable? Would it capture the engineering reality of the Saturn V rocket, the orbital mechanics, the mission control procedures? That is exactly the situation with Herodotus and the pyramids. But the distortion did not stop with one Greek traveller. After the Old Kingdom collapsed and Egypt fell into successive periods of decline, foreign rule and cultural fragmentation, the institutional memory of how the pyramids were built simply dissolved. By the medieval period, even the Egyptians living in the shadow of Giza could not explain their construction. Arab historians speculated wildly. European explorers, arriving with their own assumptions about what African civilizations were and were not capable of, often refused to believe that the people of ancient Egypt could have produced these structures at all. The mystery of the pyramids was not original. It was manufactured, layer by layer over centuries, by the slow erosion of knowledge, the substitution of bias for evidence, and the very human preference for a dramatic explanation over a documented one. And then modern archaeology arrived, and everything changed. Chronologies indicate that the decisive turning point came in the 1990s, when excavations near the Giza Plateau uncovered something no ancient astronaut theorist had ever predicted: a workers' village, not a slave compound, not a prison camp, a village with organised housing, medical facilities, bread ovens, breweries, and burial sites where workers were interred with honours and grave goods. These were not the graves of slaves. These were the graves of craftsmen, of professionals, of people the state considered important enough to bury with care. Inscriptions describe a rotating workforce, a state-organised labour system, gangs of workers who competed in friendly rivalry, carved their names into blocks, names like Friends of Khufu, and received regular wages in the form of food, beer, and clothing. The builders of the greatest structures in human history were not oppressed masses driven by fear. They were skilled labourers organised with a precision that rivals anything the modern construction industry deploys today. So how then did we spend so long believing otherwise? That is the story we are about to tell. It stretches from the reign of Khufu through the collapse of Egyptian civilization, through the pens of Greek historians and medieval Arab scholars, through the biases of colonial-era exploration, through the explosion of 20th century myth-making in books and films and television, and finally into the excavation trenches where the real evidence waited, buried not by conspiracy, but by centuries of accumulated misunderstanding. The pyramids were never a mystery of who built them. They were a case study in how easily the truth can be buried, not by secrecy, but by the stories we prefer to tell. The Old Kingdom of Egypt did not begin with a whisper. It announced itself in stone. Around 2,560 years BC, on a plateau of solid limestone bedrock stretching across the western bank of the Nile, Pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, set in motion the most ambitious construction project in the history of human civilization. No blueprint has survived. No single document from that era says plainly, "This is how we did it." What survives instead is the result: 146 metres of precision-cut limestone rising from the desert floor in a shape so geometrically pure that it has defied serious deterioration for 4,500 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza is not the oldest pyramid in Egypt. That distinction belongs to the Step Pyramid of Djoser, built roughly a century earlier, but it is the largest, the most studied, and the most mythologized. It held the record as the tallest man-made structure on Earth for approximately 3,800 years, a record not surpassed until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in England in the 14th century AD. Consider what 3,800 years means in human terms. When the Great Pyramid finally lost that record, The Roman Empire had already risen and collapsed. The Renaissance was underway, and the pyramids had already spent roughly 2,000 years being misunderstood. That misunderstanding, it turns out, has its own history, one as layered and complex as the monument itself. Khufu ruled during a period of extraordinary, such a centralised power. And the Old Kingdom pharaohs commanded not just armies and taxes, but the full organisational capacity of a state that had been developing its administrative infrastructure for centuries before the first pyramid stone was ever cut. Layers reveal a society with sophisticated scribal schools, a professional class of architects and engineers, a legal system governing land and labour, and a theology that made the construction of the royal tomb not a vanity project, but a cosmic obligation. The pyramid was not built to impress future generations. It was built to ensure the pharaoh's safe passage into the afterlife, into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, and to maintain the divine order, known as Ma'at, that kept the universe in balance. Religion, politics, and engineering were not separate categories in Old Kingdom Egypt. They were the same project, and the workforce that executed that project. Evidence is unambiguous on this point. Inscriptions describe a rotating system of conscripted labourers, not slaves, but Egyptian citizens fulfilling a civic and religious duty, much the way later civilizations would require military service. They worked in shifts, they were housed, they were fed. Archaeological analysis of animal bones from the worker village sites indicates they consumed beef, sheep and goat at rates suggesting a diet more substantial than many ordinary Egyptians enjoyed. When they died on the job, they were buried with care near the monument they had helped raise. This was an organised state operation, not a humanitarian catastrophe. Now that distinction matters enormously, because the catastrophe version is the one that dominated the historical record for most of the last 2,000 years. And understanding why that version took hold is precisely what makes this story worth telling. The central tension of the pyramids is not structural, it is not engineering, it is epistemological, meaning it is about how we know what we know and how confidently we hold beliefs that turn out to be wrong. For centuries, the gap between what the pyramids actually represented and what people believed about them grew steadily wider, not because of any organised deception, not because powerful forces suppressed the truth, but because knowledge is fragile. Memory fades, bias fills the gaps, the evidence leaves open, and dramatic stories travel further and faster than careful ones. The pyramids were always there. The misunderstanding was the moving target, which leads to the question that threads through every chapter of this story, the question that the physical evidence forces us to ask once we look at it clearly. If the builders were known, if the methods were real, if the workforce was organised and documented, why did the world spend so long insisting otherwise? The answer begins not in Egypt, but in the gap between what actually happened and the moment someone first tried to write it down. And in that gap, roughly 2,000 years wide, a Greek historian arrived with a notebook, a set of assumptions, and an audience hungry for drama. Every year, without fail, the Nile flooded. Between June and September, the river rose across the farmlands of Egypt, submerging the fields that fed the civilization and depositing the rich black silt that made Egyptian agriculture among the most productive in the ancient world. For Egyptian farmers, this annual cycle was not a disaster. It was the calendar. And for roughly 3 to 4 months each year, those same farmers could not work their land. The state had a use for them. This is one of the most important and least dramatic facts about pyramid construction. A significant portion of the workforce was seasonal. Agricultural labourers whose fields were underwater reported to the plateau, joining a permanent core of skilled craftsmen, engineers, surveyors and administrators who worked year-round. The pyramid was not built despite Egyptian society. It was built through it, woven into the existing rhythms of labour, religion, and civic obligation that structured ordinary Egyptian life. The organisational scale required staggers the imagination even by modern standards. Estimates based on archaeological evidence and engineering analysis suggest the Great Pyramid required a sustained workforce of somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people at its peak. Feeding that workforce alone demanded a supply chain of extraordinary complexity. Cattle herders, bakers, brewers, fishermen, administrators tracking rations, scribes recording daily outputs. The worker village excavated near Giza contained industrial-scale bakeries capable of producing bread in quantities that only make sense if you are feeding a small city every single day. This was not improvised. Someone planned it. That someone was the administrative apparatus of the old kingdom state, a bureaucratic structure that had been developing for centuries before Khufu's reign and had, by the time of the Great Pyramid's construction, reached a level of organisational sophistication that Egypt would arguably not surpass again. Viziers managed the overall project. Overseers commanded individual gangs. Scribes tracked everything. The delivery of copper tools, the consumption of bread and beer, the movement of stone from quarry to plateau. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri, discovered in 2013 AD and among the oldest papyri ever found, contain the daily journal of an official named Merer, who spent months ferrying white limestone from the quarries at Tura across the Nile to Giza. His entries are precise, bureaucratic, and utterly ordinary. The records of a man doing a job, not a witness to a miracle. The skilled workforce was something else entirely. Stonemasons who understood how to dress limestone to tolerances measured in millimetres, surveyors who could establish a level baseline across 5.5 hectares using water channels and plumb bobs, architects who understood load distribution well enough to design interior chambers and relieving voids that have kept the structure intact for 4,500 years. These were not men drafted reluctantly into unfamiliar labour. They were professionals, many of whom came from families where the craft had passed across generations. And inscriptions describe worker gangs with names: Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkora, competitive teams who tracked their progress and apparently took considerable pride in it. Graffiti scratched into the hidden relieving chambers above the king's chamber, spaces that were sealed and never intended for human eyes again after construction, contained the names and boasts of the gangs who worked there. They wrote for themselves, not for posterity. That detail alone tells you something significant about who these people were. The religious dimension gave the entire enterprise its urgency. The pharaoh was not a mortal king in the way later civilizations would understand monarchy. He was a divine intermediary, the earthly manifestation of Horus, destined on death to become Osiris and take his place among the gods. As the pyramid was his vehicle for that transformation. To build it poorly, to leave it incomplete, to fail in its construction, was not merely a professional failure. It was a cosmological one. The stakes embedded in the project explain the resources committed to it, better than any theory about slave labour or coercion ever could. And so the pyramid rose, not through suffering, not through mystery, but through the disciplined application of human knowledge, human labour, and human faith, all organised by a state that understood, better than most civilizations that followed it, how to align individual effort with collective purpose. The builders knew who they were. Their supervisors kept records. Their names, in some cases, survive. So here is the question that the evidence forces us to ask. If the workforce was documented, and if the methods were understood, if the project was managed with a precision that left paper trails, why, within a few centuries, did that knowledge begin to dissolve? Why did the architects of one of history's greatest achievements become, to later generations, an unsolved mystery? Around 450 years BC, a Greek traveller from the city of Halicarnassus on the western coast of what is now Turkey arrived in Egypt with a curiosity that bordered on obsession. His name was Herodotus, and the account he wrote of what he saw and heard there would shape how the Western world understood the pyramids for the next 2,500 years. Herodotus was, by any measure, a remarkable figure. He travelled farther and asked more questions than almost any other writer of his era. His 9-volume work, The Histories, that covered everything from the Persian Wars to the geography of the known world, and his descriptions of Egypt filled an entire volume with observations about the Nile, the priests, the animals, the customs, and the monuments. Later generations named him the Father of History, a title that obscures a crucial problem. He arrived in Egypt roughly 2,100 years after the Great Pyramid was completed. To grasp what that gap means, the distance in time between Herodotus visiting Giza and the pyramid's construction is greater than the distance between Herodotus and us today. He was not close to the source. He was not even in the same historical era. He was a tourist, examining ruins of a civilization so ancient that even the Egyptians of his day had only fragmentary knowledge of how those ruins came to be. What he had, yet in place of evidence, was conversation. Herodotus spoke to Egyptian priests through interpreters. He collected stories from locals. He gathered oral traditions that had themselves been passed across dozens of generations before reaching him. And he wrote it all down with the confidence of a man who believed he was recording fact. His account of the pyramid's construction described 100,000 workers labouring in rotating shifts of 3 months each, whipped and driven across the desert under the absolute authority of a tyrannical king. He described Khufu as a despot who shuttered Egypt's temples, forced his people into degrading labour, and even prostituted his own daughter to fund the construction. These are extraordinary claims. They also appear nowhere in any Egyptian source. Not one inscription from the Old Kingdom supports the portrait Herodotus painted. Not one administrative document, not one tomb biography, not one royal decree describes a forced labour system built on cruelty and coercion. The documentary record that does survive, including the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, the worker village evidence, the gang names scratched into hidden chambers, tells a categorically different story, as the previous chapter established. The workforce Herodotus described and the workforce the archaeological record describes are almost unrecognisable as the same project. The explanation is not that Herodotus was dishonest. The more uncomfortable truth is that he was doing exactly what any careful traveller would do in the absence of primary sources. He listened to the best available accounts and recorded them faithfully. So the problem is that best available accounts in 450 years BC Egypt were not primary sources. They were folk memory. They were priestly tradition. They were stories shaped by 2,000 years of retelling, cultural change, foreign occupation, and the very human tendency to make the distant past more dramatic than the documented present. There is a specific dynamic at work here that historians recognise across many cultures. The older and more remote an event becomes, the more it attracts legendary elaboration. The construction of the pyramids, by the time Herodotus arrived, was already ancient history to the Egyptians themselves. The Old Kingdom had collapsed. Intermediate periods of fragmentation had followed. Foreign dynasties had ruled. Yet the institutional knowledge held by the engineers and administrators who managed the original project had long since ceased to be transmitted in any organised way. Into that vacuum, legend moved, as it always does, and because Herodotus wrote in Greek, and Greek became the intellectual language of the Mediterranean world, and his work survived while so many others did not, his version of events acquired an authority it had not earned. Later, Greek and Roman writers cited him. Medieval scholars cited those writers. The image of the pyramid as a monument to tyranny and forced suffering became embedded in the Western historical imagination so deeply that even the 18th and 19th century scholars, who should have known better, often took it as a starting point rather than questioning it. Written history, it turns out, is not the same as accurate history. It is simply the version that survived. And when the version that survived was already shaped by 2,000 years of oral drift before it was ever written down, the distortion built into the foundation is invisible unless you know to look for it. The question then is what happens next, because Herodotus was only the beginning. The Old Kingdom did not end quietly. Around 2180 years BC, after roughly 5 centuries of centralised pharaonic rule, the Egyptian state fractured. The causes were multiple and still debated. A prolonged drought that disrupted the Nile flooding cycle, the gradual erosion of royal authority as regional governors accumulated power, a series of weak successors to the throne. Whatever the precise combination, the result was the same. The administrative machinery that had made the Pyramid Age possible simply stopped functioning. What followed was a period Egyptologists call the First Intermediate Period, roughly 125 years of fragmented rule, regional conflict, and institutional collapse. The centralised bureaucracy that had coordinated tens of thousands of workers, tracked tool inventories, managed grain supplies, and recorded construction methods dissolved into competing local power structures with no interest in preserving the technical knowledge of a system they had replaced. This is the moment the clock started running on the loss of pyramid building knowledge, not because anyone decided to suppress it, not because a conquering power burned the records, but because the organisational infrastructure that held the knowledge together simply ceased to exist. And knowledge without an institution to transmit it has a very short lifespan. Consider how specialised that knowledge actually was. The surveying techniques required to establish a near-perfect cardinal alignment across a 5.5 hectare base, the understanding of limestone stress and load distribution that allowed interior chambers to remain intact under millions of tons of stone, the logistics systems for coordinating the delivery of granite from Aswan, 800 kilometres south, to a construction site on the Giza Plateau. None of this was the kind of knowledge a farmer or a local priest would carry. It lived in specific professional communities, in the families of master builders, in the scribal schools attached to royal projects, in the administrative offices of the vizier's court. When those communities dispersed, the knowledge dispersed with them. Egypt did recover. The Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2055 years BC, reunified the country and produced another era of remarkable cultural achievement. Pharaohs built again, pyramids and temples and tombs across the length of the Nile Valley. But the Middle Kingdom pyramids are notably different from their Old Kingdom predecessors. Smaller, built with rubble cores rather than solid limestone, less precise. The engineering peak of Khufu's era was not recaptured because the specific chain of transmitted expertise that had produced it had been broken. By the time the New Kingdom arrived, roughly 1,550 years BC, Egypt's greatest builders had shifted their focus entirely. The Valley of the Kings replaced the Pyramid Plateau. Rock-cut tombs, hidden rather than displayed, became the royal burial form of choice. The Giza Plateau was still venerated, still considered sacred, but the pyramids there had become ancient monuments even to the Egyptians who lived in their shadow. The Great Sphinx, partially buried in sand, was excavated by the New Kingdom pharaoh Thutmose IV after, according to his own inscribed account, the monument appeared to him in a dream and asked to be freed. That detail is telling. A pharaoh of Egypt, ruler of a civilization with direct cultural continuity back to the pyramid builders, encountered one of the monuments on his own doorstep as something mysterious and ancient, something that communicated through dreams rather than documents. The institutional memory was gone. What replaced it was something far less reliable: mythology, priestly tradition, and the interpretive frameworks of each successive era. Later Egyptian texts refer to the pyramids with reverence, but without technical understanding. Arab geographers who wrote about Giza in the medieval period produced accounts filled with speculation about treasure chambers, magical protections, and the works of pre-flood civilizations, not because they were inventing stories carelessly, but because they genuinely did not know. The information simply was not available to them. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the history of lost knowledge. Absence does not stay empty. When the accurate account disappears, the human need to explain what is visible and inexplicable fills the gap with whatever materials are culturally available: religion, legend, rumour, and eventually, in the modern era, pseudoscience. The pyramids did not become mysterious because they were mysterious. They became mysterious because the people who understood them stopped existing, and the people who came after had no way to recover what was lost, only to imagine it. Imagination, it turns out, is a poor substitute for evidence, but it is far more available. And as Egypt passed through more conquests, more foreign rulers, and more cultural upheavals in the centuries ahead, the gap between what the pyramids actually were and what people believed about them would grow considerably wider. In the 9th century AD, a man climbed inside the Great Pyramid and did not find what he expected. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun, son of the famous Harun al-Rashid, ruler of one of the most intellectually sophisticated empires of the medieval world, ordered his workers to tunnel through the pyramid's northern face. He had heard stories, ancient accounts spoke of hidden chambers containing fabulous treasure, astronomical instruments, and the preserved wisdom of a pre-flood civilization. Al-Ma'mun was not a credulous man. He was the same caliph who established the House of Wisdom in Baghdad and commissioned Arabic translations of Greek scientific texts. But the stories about the pyramids were compelling enough that he committed significant resources to finding out whether they were true. His workers tunnelled for weeks before accidentally breaking into an existing internal passage. They followed it. They found chambers, the subterranean chamber, the Queen's chamber, eventually the Grand Gallery and the King's chamber. What they found inside those chambers was essentially nothing. No treasure, no mummies, no astronomical devices. The sarcophagus in the King's chamber was empty and lidless. Al-Mamun's expedition is historically significant, not for what it found, but for what it represents. The beginning of a long tradition of interpreting the pyramids through the assumptions of the interpreter rather than the evidence of the structure. Faced with a monument that exceeded easy explanation, and medieval Arab scholars reached for the frameworks available to them: Quranic tradition, pre-Islamic legend, the idea of a civilization before the biblical flood, and fitted the pyramids into those frameworks as best they could. Some accounts identified the pyramids as the granaries of the biblical Joseph, built to store grain during the 7 years of plenty before the 7 years of famine. This interpretation, which required ignoring the solid limestone interior of the structure entirely, nonetheless circulated widely enough that it appeared in European texts for centuries. The medieval pilgrim and travel writer John of Würzburg repeated it in the 12th century AD. The Bishop of Acre endorsed it. As late as 2015 AD, and a prominent American political figure publicly stated his belief in the Joseph Granary theory, demonstrating with uncomfortable clarity how persistent a misinterpretation can be once it finds a hospitable cultural environment. The European encounter with Egypt intensified dramatically in the 17th and 18th centuries as explorers, diplomats and scholars began arriving in larger numbers. What they brought with them, alongside their measuring instruments and notebooks, was a framework of assumptions about civilization, about which peoples were capable of what achievements, about where genuine intellectual and technical sophistication could and could not originate. Those assumptions had consequences. When European scholars confronted the pyramids, a significant number found themselves unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed about the civilization that had produced it. The reasoning, sometimes explicit and sometimes operating below the surface of academic argument, followed a pattern. These structures display engineering sophistication. The ancient Egyptians were Africans within the racial hierarchies that structured European colonial thought were presumed incapable of such sophistication. Therefore, the structures must have another explanation. This reasoning did not produce a single unified alternative theory. It produced dozens of them. Lost civilizations, survivors of Atlantis, Phoenician builders. In each case, the explanatory move was the same. Attribute the pyramids to somebody other than the people who actually built them. The evidence was never the driver of these theories. The assumption was the driver, and the theories were constructed to protect it. Layers reveal the specific damage this caused to the historical record. When European Egyptology began developing as a formal discipline in the 19th century, it did so in an intellectual environment already contaminated by these assumptions. The questions researchers asked, the evidence they prioritized, the interpretations they found plausible, all were shaped to some degree by a prior commitment to the idea that Egyptian civilization required external explanation. Genuine discoveries were made. Genuine scholarship was produced. But the foundational bias meant that certain conclusions, including the straightforward one that a sophisticated African civilization had simply built sophisticated structures faced a higher evidentiary bar than theories that moved the credit elsewhere. What makes this chapter of the story particularly significant is that the bias was largely invisible to those who held it. These were not, in most cases, men who considered themselves prejudiced. They were men who considered themselves rigorous. The assumption was so deeply embedded in their cultural framework that it functioned not as a bias to be examined, but as a background fact, the kind of thing you do not question because questioning it does not occur to you. Disbelief, it turns out, is one of the most effective ways to bury the truth. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires only a confident assumption, widely shared, and the centuries required for it to calcify into conventional wisdom. In 1971, a Swiss hotelier named Erich von Däniken sold his 40 millionth book. The book was called Chariots of the Gods, and its central argument was straightforward. Ancient monuments, including the pyramids, were too sophisticated to have been built by the civilizations credited with them. The real explanation von Däniken proposed was extraterrestrial intervention. Ancient humans had received help, technology, instruction, possibly direct physical assistance, from beings who arrived from elsewhere. The book had been published 3 years earlier, in 1968. It had been rejected by multiple publishers before finding one willing to take the risk. The manuscript had been written, in part, while von Däniken was awaiting trial for fraud and embezzlement. None of this slowed its trajectory. It became one of the best-selling works of non-fiction of the 20th century, was adapted into a documentary film that drew enormous television audiences, and launched a genre of alternative history publishing that has not stopped expanding since. Understanding why requires understanding the cultural moment into which it landed. The 1960s and 70s were a period of profound institutional distrust in the Western world. Governments had lied about wars. Established authorities had been exposed as self-serving. The idea that official history was a sanitized version of a more complex and possibly suppressed truth had genuine appeal, not just to credulous readers, but to educated people who had legitimate reasons to be sceptical of received narratives. Von Däniken's proposal that mainstream archaeology was missing something fundamental, that the experts had gotten the story wrong, resonated in a climate already primed for exactly that kind of challenge. The alien intervention theory also had a structural advantage over the straightforward historical account. It was unfalsifiable in the ways that made it most appealing. Every piece of evidence that the pyramids were built by human beings could be reframed as evidence that those human beings had divine or extraterrestrial assistance. Precision engineering, too precise for humans alone, organised labour records, possibly fabricated or incomplete. The theory was designed to absorb counter-evidence rather than be defeated by it. Von Däniken was not the only architect of modern pyramid mythology, merely the most commercially successful. The lost civilization tradition had its own lineage. Ignatius Donnelly's 1882 book, Atlantis, the antediluvian world, had proposed that a sophisticated pre-flood civilization was the true origin of ancient monuments across the globe. This idea found its 20th century heir in writers like Graham Hancock, whose 1995 book Fingerprints of the Gods argued for a technologically advanced civilization destroyed in a global catastrophe around 10,500 years BC, a civilization whose survivors, Hancock proposed, transmitted their knowledge to the builders of the pyramids. These theories shared a common architecture. Each began with genuine puzzles. There are real questions about ancient construction techniques that archaeology continues to investigate, and then leaped past the available evidence to conclusions that mainstream research had no basis to support. Each framed professional archaeologists, not as researchers, working methodically through difficult problems, but as gatekeepers actively resisting inconvenient truths. And each found a media environment increasingly optimized for exactly that framing. Television discovered that ancient mysteries attracted audiences. The 1990s and 2000s produced a sustained wave of documentary programming built around pyramid speculation, shows with titles constructed to imply revelation, presenting fringe theories in the visual language of serious investigation, interviewing alternative researchers alongside or instead of credentialed archaeologists. The format created a false equivalence. A scholar with decades of excavation experience and peer-reviewed publications appeared on screen with the same production values, the same dramatic music, and the same allocated airtime as someone whose primary qualification was a provocative book. Meanwhile, the internet arrived and industrialized the process entirely. Pyramid energy theories, the idea that the geometric form of the pyramid concentrates or generates some form of cosmic or electromagnetic force, migrated from niche occult literature into mainstream social media feeds. Specific claims proliferated that the Great Pyramid was a power station, that its internal dimensions encoded the speed of light, that it was built to align with the star Orion as part of a civilization-spanning astronomical message. Each claim travelled faster than the patient archaeological work required to address it. The asymmetry is the key point. A theory that takes 30 seconds to state can require 30 pages of evidence to properly refute. In an attention economy, 30 seconds wins every time. By the early 21st century, the gap between what professional Egyptology knew about the pyramids and what the general public believed had reached perhaps its greatest extent. The evidence was more complete than it had ever been. The myths were more widely distributed than they had ever been. Those two facts were about to collide. In 1990, a tourist's horse stumbled. The animal caught its hoof on a mud brick wall just south of the Giza Plateau, partially buried beneath the desert surface. The tourist guide reported it. Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass investigated. What he found beneath that surface would, over the following decades, fundamentally dismantle the most persistent myth in the entire history of pyramid scholarship. It was a cemetery, not a royal cemetery, not the elaborately decorated tombs of nobles and officials that Egyptologists had been cataloguing for over a century. This was a workers' cemetery. The graves were modest, constructed from the same limestone chips and mud brick that litter the plateau as construction debris. The bodies inside showed the physical signatures of hard labour, healed fractures, joint degeneration, the skeletal evidence of men and women who had spent their working lives performing heavy, repetitive physical tasks. But they had been buried with care. Some graves contained beer jars and food offerings, provisions for the afterlife. The same religious consideration extended to Egyptians of every social class. Several contained small statuettes. The burial orientation followed Egyptian religious convention. These were not mass graves, not disposal sites, not the hasty interments of an expendable workforce. They were individual burials, marked, maintained, and situated in deliberate proximity to the monuments these people had spent their lives building. To be buried near the pyramid was an honour. The workers knew it, and whoever organised their burials knew it too. The cemetery was the opening discovery. What followed as Hawass and his colleague Mark Lehner expanded their excavations through the 1990s and 2000s was the systematic uncovering of an entire lost city. The workers' village that emerged from beneath the Giza sands was not a primitive encampment. It was an organised urban settlement covering approximately 4 hectares, with distinct residential areas, administrative buildings and industrial facilities. The bakeries were industrial in scale. Archaeologists identified dozens of bread moulds and beer vats capable of producing daily rations for thousands of workers simultaneously. The food remains told a specific story: cattle, sheep, goat and fish bones, in quantities indicating that the workforce was being fed at a standard significantly above subsistence level. The cattle bones in particular were revealing beef was not the daily diet of ordinary Egyptians. It was expensive, prestigious food, and it was being supplied to construction workers in substantial quantities. The medical evidence was equally striking. Skeletal remains from the cemetery showed healed injuries, fractures that had been set and allowed to recover properly, amputations that the patient had survived, evidence of basic surgical intervention. Someone was providing medical care to injured workers and doing it well enough that people with serious injuries lived long enough to return to work and eventually die of other causes. Field hospitals, or their ancient equivalent, were part of the operational infrastructure. Then came the papyri. In 2013, a French archaeological team working at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast discovered a sealed cave system containing a collection of papyrus documents that would become the oldest papyri ever found in Egypt. Among them was the Journal of Merer, an official who spent months during Khufu's reign managing a team of roughly 200 men whose specific job was transporting white limestone from the quarries at Tura across the Nile to the Giza Plateau. His entries cover a period of several months and are written with the dry precision of a man filing routine administrative reports. The journal records delivery dates, it records the names of receiving officials, it records rest days, it records the movement of Merer's team through a logistical network that included purpose-built canals, organised harbour facilities, and a chain of command that extended upward to the Vizier Ankef, who was, the records indicate, directly overseeing the final stages of the Great Pyramid's construction. This was not mythology. This was not folk memory passed across 2,000 years of oral tradition. This was contemporary documentation written by a participant describing a specific, organised, state-managed operation, taken together: the cemetery, the village, the medical evidence, the administrative papyri, the tool marks, the construction ramps partially preserved in satellite imagery and ground survey, the archaeological picture that emerged by the second decade of the 21st century was unambiguous. The pyramids were built by a structured, well-fed, medically supported, administratively organised workforce of Egyptian citizens who took enough pride in their contribution that they carved their gang names into chambers no one would ever see again. The ground had been holding this information for 4,500 years. It simply required people willing to look, and crucially, willing to accept what the evidence actually said rather than what 2 millennia of accumulated mythology had prepared them to find. The story of who built the pyramids had always been there, buried Yes, but in sand, not secrecy. The biggest stones in the Great Pyramid weigh approximately 80 tons. That fact has done more to fuel alternative theories about pyramid construction than almost any other single detail. 80 tons is roughly the weight of a fully loaded articulated truck. Moving one such block without machinery across desert terrain and then raising it to a precise position within a structure rising over 140 meters, to many people that simply sounds impossible. It is not impossible. It requires understanding a set of principles that ancient Egyptian engineers had spent generations developing, and that modern researchers have now spent decades testing, refining, and in several cases demonstrating with direct physical experiment. Start with transport, because that is where the evidence is most concrete. A painting discovered in the tomb of an ancient Egyptian official named Djehuti-Hotep, dating to roughly 19,900 years BC, the Middle Kingdom period, depicts a colossal statue being moved on a sledge. The statue, estimated to weigh approximately 60 tons, sits on a wooden sledge being hauled by 172 men pulling on ropes. Crucially, a figure at the front of the sledge is pouring liquid, almost certainly water, onto the ground directly ahead of the runners. This detail, for a long time overlooked, turns out to be the key to the entire transport problem. In 2014, a team of physicists at the University of Amsterdam tested the effect of water lubrication on sand friction using scaled physical models. Their findings, published in the journal Physical Review Letters, demonstrated that wet sand reduces the friction coefficient of a sledge by approximately 50% compared to dry sand. Yet the optimal saturation level, enough water to make the sand slightly damp but not muddy, produces a firm surface that the sledge glides across with significantly reduced resistance. At that level of lubrication, the force required to move a heavily loaded sledge drops to roughly half of what dry conditions demand. Applied to the construction of the Great Pyramid, this finding transforms the transportation problem from miraculous to merely demanding. A workforce of sufficient size, using wooden sledges on prepared and lubricated pathways, could move multi-ton limestone blocks across the plateau without any technology beyond ropes, wood, water, and organised human effort. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated this repeatedly. In the 1990s, a Japanese team attempted to build a small replica pyramid using only ancient techniques and found, after initial struggles, that water lubrication was the critical variable they had been missing. The ramp question is more contested and more interesting for being so. Several competing theories exist for how blocks were raised as the pyramid grew in height. The straight external ramp, a single inclined plane of compacted rubble running from the base to the construction level, works mathematically at lower heights, but becomes impractical as the pyramid rises because maintaining a usable gradient would require a ramp longer than the pyramid itself and containing nearly as much material. No evidence of such a structure has been found in the quantities required. The spiral ramp theory proposes a ramp winding around the exterior of the pyramid as it rose, always beginning from the base. This solves the length problem, but creates an alignment problem. A ramp covering the pyramid's corners would have made it impossible for builders to check and maintain the precision of those corners during construction. The most technically compelling recent proposal came in 2017, when French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin presented evidence, supported by three-dimensional modelling and microgravity survey data, showing anomalous density variations inside the pyramid for an internal spiral ramp system. Under this model, a straight external ramp was used for the lower third of the structure, where volume and weight requirements were greatest. Above that level, blocks were hauled through an internal ramp spiralling just inside the pyramid's outer casing, with notched openings at the corners allowing the blocks to be levered around the turns. The corner openings would also explain something previously puzzling: why certain corner sections of the pyramid's upper levels appear, in internal survey data, to be slightly less dense than the surrounding masonry. The alignment precision remains, by any measure, the most technically impressive aspect of the entire construction. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within 2.1 centimetres across its entire perimeter. Its sides face true north, south, east and west, with an average deviation of less than 0.04 of a degree. Achieving this without modern instruments required sophisticated astronomical observation, most likely using the rotation of circumpolar stars to establish true north, a method that Egyptian surveyors would have had both the knowledge and the clear desert skies to execute. None of this required supernatural assistance. It required observation, calculation, accumulated expertise, and the willingness to invest the time that precision demands. The mystery does not dissolve into disappointment when examined this way. It dissolves into something considerably more impressive: the recognition that human beings, working with materials and methods available to any sufficiently organised society, built something that has outlasted every empire that came after them. Every myth about the pyramids, when you trace it back far enough, arrives at the same starting point. Not a conspiracy, not a suppressed document, not a powerful institution deciding that the truth was too dangerous to share. The starting point in every case is a failure of belief. Specifically, the failure to believe that ordinary human beings, working with the materials and knowledge available to them, could have produced something this extraordinary. That failure is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the thread connecting everything this story has covered. Herodotus did not deliberately distort the historical record. He arrived 2,100 years after the construction, found a civilization that had itself lost the institutional memory of how the pyramids were built, and recorded the most dramatic version of events that his sources offered. The distortion was not malicious. It was the natural result of a 2,000-year gap filled with oral tradition, cultural change, and the human preference for compelling narrative over documented fact. The medieval scholars who identified the pyramids as Joseph's granaries were not stupid. They were working within a theological framework that structured all knowledge, and they fitted an inexplicable monument into that framework as logically as their assumptions permitted. The European colonial scholars who doubted Egyptian capability were not conducting bad archaeology. Many of them were meticulous in their methods. They were conducting good archaeology inside a corrupted assumption, which meant that their conclusions, however carefully derived, were built on a foundation that pointed systematically away from the truth. And Erich von Däniken, and the television producers who followed his template, and the social media algorithms that amplified the most spectacular claims, none of them set out to bury the real story of the pyramids. They set out to attract an audience. The alien intervention theory attracted a larger audience than the work of Village Evidence, not because people are foolish, but because a story about extraterrestrial architects is structurally more dramatic than a story about rotating labour gangs and water-lubricated sledges. Dramatic stories travel, careful ones accumulate. This is the mechanism by which the truth about the pyramids was buried, not in sand, not in secrecy, but in the compounding weight of successive generations, each adding their own layer of interpretation, assumption, and myth to a structure that was already ancient before the first distortion began. Now consider what the evidence, assembled in full, actually shows. The workforce was not enslaved. It was organised, rotated, fed, substantially above the standard of ordinary Egyptian life, provided with medical care, and buried with religious dignity in proximity to the monument it had built. The gang names scratched into hidden chambers, spaces sealed for 4,500 years before modern archaeologists opened them, were not the markings of men working under compulsion. They were the signatures of professionals who wanted credit for what they had accomplished. The methods were not supernatural. Water lubrication reduced friction on transport sledges to manageable levels. Ramp systems, whether external, spiral, or the internal hybrid that microgravity surveys suggest, provided the mechanical means to raise blocks to height. Astronomical observation using circumpolar star rotation established alignments of a precision that has survived 4 millennia of seismic activity, temperature variation, and the slow settling of limestone on bedrock. Every element of the construction, examined individually, resolves into a technique that human beings with sufficient knowledge, organisation, and time could execute. The knowledge was not lost by design. It was lost because the institutional infrastructure that transmitted it, the scribal schools, the professional builder families, the administrative apparatus of the Old Kingdom state, collapsed when the state itself collapsed, and collapsed completely enough that even subsequent Egyptian civilizations could not recover it. Knowledge without an institution to carry it has the lifespan of the people who hold it. When those people dispersed, the knowledge dispersed with them, and the gap they left was filled, as such gaps always are, by imagination. What emerges from the full account is not a diminished story, it is a considerably more remarkable one. The pyramids are not evidence that human beings needed help to achieve the extraordinary. They are evidence of precisely the opposite, that human beings, given sufficient organisation, accumulated knowledge, shared purpose, and the institutional capacity to coordinate effort across decades, are capable of producing achievements so far beyond the ordinary that every subsequent generation has struggled to believe they were humanly possible. That struggle, that persistent failure to credit human capability, is the real story the pyramids tell, not the story of what was built on the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago, the story of how we have responded to it ever since. The pyramids were never the mystery, we were. And the greatest thing archaeology has given us is not the answer to how they were built. It is the reminder of what we are capable of, a reminder we have been reluctant across 20 centuries of myth-making to fully accept. The stones were always there, so was the truth. We simply kept choosing the better story.